Mary, Queen of Scots, 1542 to 87. 1. The Fairy Queen. Within the interlocking dramas of the Scottish Reformation and Elizabethan politics, the tragedy of Mary Stuart moved with all the fascination of beauty, passionate love, religious and political conflict, murder, revolution, and heroic death. Her ancestry almost assured a violent end. She was the daughter of the Stuart James V of Scotland and of Mary of Guise, Lorraine, and France. She was the granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, who was the daughter of Henry VII of England. She was therefore niece, loosely called cousin, of Bloody Mary and Elizabeth. By common consent, she was the legitimate heir to the English crown if Elizabeth should die without issue. And for those who, like all Catholics and at one time Henry VIII, considered Elizabeth a bastard and therefore ineligible to rule, Mary Stuart, and not Elizabeth Tudor, should have succeeded to the throne of England in 1558. To make tragedy certain, Mary, on becoming Queen of France, 1559, allowed her followers and her state papers to call her Queen of England. It had long been a vain pretense of French kings to be also kings of England, and of English kings to be also kings of France. But in this case the pretense came close to a generally acknowledged claim. Elizabeth could not be sure of her crown as long as Mary lived. Only common sense could have saved the situation, and sovereigns rarely stoop so low. Mary was offered kingdoms within a year of her birth. Within a week of her birth, her father's death made her Queen of Scots. Henry VIII, hoping to unite Scotland as an appanage to England, proposed that the infant be betrothed to his son Edward, be sent to England, and be there brought up, presumably as a Protestant, to be Edward's queen. Her Catholic mother accepted instead the offer of Henry II of France, 1548, to give her in marriage to his son the Dauphin. To guard her against being kidnapped into England, Mary, aged 6, was hurried off to France. She remained there 13 years, was educated with the royal children, and became completely French in spirit, being already half French in blood. As she matured into youth, she developed all the charms of young womanhood in beauty of features and form, sprightliness of mind, and merry grace of ways and speech. She sang sweetly, played the lute well, taught Latin, and wrote poetry that poets affected to praise. Courtiers throbbed to the snow of her pure face, Brantôme, the gold of her curled and plaited hair, Ronsard, the slender elegance of her hands, the fullness of her bust, and even the grave and sober L'Hôpital thought that such loveliness must be the vesture of a god. She became the most attractive and accomplished figure at the most polished court in Europe. When, aged 16, she married the Dauphin, April 24, 1558, and still more when, aged 17, she became, through his accession, Queen of France, all the hopes of a fanciful dream seemed to have come true. But Francis II died, December 5, 1560, after 2 years of rule. Mary, a widow at 18, thought of retiring to an estate at Durant, for she loved France. But meanwhile Scotland had gone Protestant. It was in danger of being lost to France as an ally. The French government held it to be Mary's duty to go to Edinburgh and lead her native land back to the French alliance and the Catholic faith. Unwillingly, Mary reconciled herself to leaving the comforts and brilliance of the French civilization for life in a Scotland which she could barely remember, and which she pictured as a land of barbarism and cold. She wrote to the leading Scottish nobles, affirming her fidelity to Scotland. She did not tell them that in her marriage contract she had deeded Scotland to the kings of France if she died without issue. The nobles, Protestant as well as Catholic, were charmed. The Scottish Parliament invited her to come and possess her throne. She asked Elizabeth for a safe conduct through England. It was refused. On August 14, 1561, Mary sailed from Calais, bidding France a tearful farewell, and gazing at the receding coast till nothing remained but the sea. 5 days later she disembarked at Leith, the port of Edinburgh, and discovered Scotland. 2. Scotland. 1560 to 61. It was a nation of ancient roots and rooted ways. Bound by the rough highlands of the north to a feudal regime of almost independent nobles organizing and exploiting a half-primitive culture of hunting, herding, and tenant tillage. Favored in the south by lovely lowlands, fertile with rain, but darkened by long winters and crippling cold. A people struggling to create a moral and civilized order out of illiteracy, illegitimacy, corruption, lawlessness, and violence. Riddled with superstition, and sending witches to the stake, seeking in a tense religious faith some hope of a less arduous life. To offset the divisive power of the barons, the kings had supported the Catholic clergy, and had dowered these with wealth leading to venality, lethargy, and concubines. The nobles itched for the riches of the church. They debased the clergy by filling ecclesiastical offices with their worldly sons. They declared for the Reformation, and made the Scottish Parliament, which they controlled, the master alike of church and state. External danger was the strongest incentive to internal unity. England felt unsafe in an island shared with her by untamed Scots. Time and again she sought, by diplomacy, marriage, or war, to bring Scotland under English rule. Fearful of absorption, Scotland allied herself with a France traditionally hostile to England. Cecil advised Elizabeth to support the Protestant nobles against their Catholic queen, so Scotland would be divided and would cease to be a peril to England or a support to France. Moreover, the Protestant leaders, if successful, might reject Mary, enthrone a Protestant noble, and make all Scotland Protestant. Privately, Cecil dreamed of uniting such a Scotland to England by persuading Elizabeth to marry such a king. When France sent a force into Scotland to suppress the Protestants, Elizabeth dispatched an army to protect them and drive out the French. Beaten in the field, the French representatives in Scotland signed at Edinburgh, July 6, 1560, a fateful treaty requiring not only that the French should leave Scotland, but that Mary should cease to claim the throne of England. On the advice of her husband, Francis II, Mary refused to ratify the treaty. Elizabeth took note. The religious situation was equally confused. The Scottish Reformation Parliament of 1560 officially abolished Catholicism and established Calvinist Protestantism as the religion of the state. But these acts did not receive from Mary the royal ratification then required to make parliamentary decrees the law of the land. Catholic priests still held most of the Scottish benefices. Half the nobles were papists, and John Hamilton of royal blood still came to Parliament as the Catholic primate of Scotland. In Edinburgh, however, and in St. Andrews, Perth, Stirling, and Aberdeen, a large proportion of the middle classes had been won to Calvinism by devoted preachers under the lead of John Knox. In the year before Mary's coming, Knox and his aides drew up a book of discipline, defining their doctrine and purposes. Religion was to mean Protestantism. The godly were to mean Calvinists alone. Idolatry was to include the Mass, invocation of saints, adoration of images, and the keeping of the same, and the obstinate maintainers and teachers of such abominations ought not to escape the punishment of the civil magistrate. All doctrine repugnant to the gospel was to be utterly suppressed as damnable to man's salvation. Ministers were to be elected by the congregations, were to establish schools open to all godly children, and were to have control of the Scottish universities, St. Andrews, Glasgow, and Aberdeen. The wealth of the Catholic Church and the continued ecclesiastical tithes were to be devoted to the needs of the ministers, the education of the people, and the relief of the poor. The new kirk, and not the secular state, was to legislate on morals and prescribe penalties for offenses: drunkenness, gluttony, profanity, extravagance of dress, oppression of the poor, obscenity, fornication, and adultery. All who resisted the new doctrine or persistently absented themselves from its services were to be turned over to the secular arm, with the Kirk's recommendation that they be put to death. However, the lords who dominated Parliament refused to accept the Book of Discipline, January 1561. They had no relish for a powerful and independent Kirk, and they had their own plans for using the wealth of the superseded church. The book remained the goal and guide of the Kirk's development. Defeated in his attempt to establish a theocracy, a government by priests claiming to speak for God, Knox labored with massive tenacity to organize the new ministry, to find funds for its support, and to spread it throughout Scotland in the face of a still functioning Catholic clergy. The dogmatic force of his preaching and the enthusiasm of his congregation made him a power in Edinburgh and in the state. The Catholic Queen would have to reckon with him before she could consolidate her rule. 3. Mary and Knox, 1561–65. She had arranged to arrive in Scotland a fortnight before she was expected, for she had feared some opposition to her landing. But word of her arrival at Leith spread through the capital, and soon the streets were crowded with people. They were surprised to find that their queen was a pretty and vivacious girl not yet 19 years old. Most of them cheered her as she rode gracefully on her palfrey to Holyrood Palace. And there the lords, Protestant and Catholic, welcomed her, proud that Scotland had so charming a ruler, who might some day, in person or through a son, bring England under a Scottish sovereign. The two portraits that have come down to us support her reputation as one of the most beautiful women of her time. We cannot tell how far the now nameless painters idealized her, but in both cases we see the finely molded features, the lovely hands, the luxuriant chestnut hair that entranced barons and biographers. Yet those pictures hardly reveal to us the real attractiveness of the young queen, her buoyant spirit, her laughing mouth, her nimble-witted speech, her fresh enthusiasm, her capacity for kindness and friendliness, her longing for affection, her reckless admiration of strong men. It was her tragedy that she wished to be a woman as well as a queen, to feel all the warmth of romance without abating the privileges of rule. She thought of herself in terms of chivalric tales, of proud yet gentle beauties, at once chaste and sensuous, capable of ardent longing and sensitive suffering, of tender pity, incorruptible loyalty, and a courage rising as danger rose. She was an expert horsewoman, leaped fences and ditches rashly, and could bear the hardship of campaigns without weariness or complaint. But she was neither physically nor mentally fit to be a queen. She was frail in all but nervous vigor. She was subject to fainting fits that looked like epilepsy, and some undiagnosed ailment often hampered her with pain. She had not the masculine intelligence of Elizabeth. She was often clever but rarely wise. Repeatedly she let passion ruin diplomacy. At times she showed remarkable self-control, patience, and tact, and then again she would let go with hot temper and sharp tongue. She was cursed with beauty, unblessed with brains, and her character was her fate. She tried hard to meet the manifold dangers of her situation, poised between grasping lords, hostile preachers, and a decadent Catholic clergy that did no honor to her trusting faith. She chose as leaders of her Privy Council two Protestants, her bastard half-brother Lord James Stuart, later Earl of Murray, or Moray, aged 26, and William Maitland of Lethington, 36, who had more intellect than his character could handle, and who shifted from side to side in compromises till his death. The goal of Lethington's diplomacy was admirable, the union of England and Scotland as the only alternative to a consuming hostility. In May of 1562, Mary sent him to England to arrange an interview between herself and Elizabeth. Elizabeth consented, but her council demurred, fearing that even the most indirect admission of Mary's claim to the succession would encourage Catholic attempts to assassinate Elizabeth. The two queens corresponded with diplomatic affection, while each sought to play cat to the other's mouse. Mary's first 3 years of rule were a success in everything but religion. Though she could never reconcile herself to the climate or the culture of Scotland, she sought, with dances, masks, and charm, to make Holyrood Palace a little Paris in a sub-Arctic zone, and most of the lords thawed under the sun of her gaiety. Knox growled that they were bewitched. She allowed Murray and Lethington to administer the kingdom, which they did reasonably well. For a time, even the religious problem seemed to be solved by her concessions. When papal agents urged her to restore Catholicism as the official religion of the land, she replied that this was at present impossible. Elizabeth would forcibly intervene. To appease the Scottish Protestants, she issued, August 26, 1561, a proclamation forbidding the Catholics to attempt changes in the established religion, but she asked to be allowed to practice her own worship privately and to have Mass said for her in the royal chapel. On Sunday, August 24th, Mass was there celebrated. A few Protestants gathered outside and demanded that the idolatrous priest should die, but Murray barred their entry into the chapel, while his aides led the priest to safety. On the following Sunday, Knox denounced the Lords for permitting the Mass, and told his congregation that to him one Mass was more offense than 10,000 armed foes. The Queen sent for him and strove to win his tolerance. On September 4th, in her palace, the two faiths met in a historic interview, whose details are known to us only from Knox's report. She reproached him for having stirred up rebellion against the duly constituted authority of her mother, and for having written his blast against the monstrous regiment of women, which had denounced all female sovereigns. He answered that, if to rebuke idolatry be to raise subjects against their princes, then cannot I be excused? For it has pleased God to make me one amongst many, to disclose unto this realm the vanity of the papistical religions, and the deceit, pride, and tyranny of that Roman Antichrist, the Pope. As for the blast, madam, that book was written most especially against that wicked Jezebel of England, Mary Tudor. Knox's report continues, Think ye, quoth she, that subjects may resist their princes? If he, Knox, replied, their princes exceed their bounds, it is no doubt they may be resisted even by power. The Queen stood as it were amazed. At length she said, Well, then, I perceive that my subjects shall obey you and not me. God forbid, answered he, that ever I take upon me to command any to obey me, or yet to let subjects at liberty to do what pleaseth them. But my travail is that both princes and subjects obey God. And this subjection, madam, unto God and unto his troubled church is the greatest dignity that flesh can get upon this earth. Yea, quoth she, but ye are not the kirk that I will nourish. I will defend the kirk of Rome, for I think it is the true kirk of God. Your will, quoth he, madam, is no reason. Neither doth your thought make that Roman harlot to be the true and immaculate spouse of Jesus Christ. And wonder not, madam, that I call Rome a harlot, for that church is altogether polluted with all kind of spiritual fornication. My conscience, said she, is not so. If this conversation is faithfully reported, it was a dramatic confrontation of monarchy with theocratic democracy, of Catholicism with Calvinism. If we may believe Knox, the Queen took his reproofs without retaliation, merely saying, Ye are our saying, overmuch sore for me. She went off to dinner, and Knox to his ministry. Lethington wished Mr. Knox would deal more gently with her, being a young princess unpersuaded. His followers did not feel that he had been too hard with her. When she appeared in public, some called her idolater, and children informed her that hearing Mass was a sin. The Edinburgh magistrates issued a decree of banishment for monks, friars, priests, nuns, adulterers, and all sick, filthy persons. Mary deposed the magistrates and ordered new elections. At Stirling, the priests who tried to minister to her were driven off with bloody heads, while she wept helplessly. The General Assembly of the Kirk demanded that she should be forbidden to hear Mass anywhere, but the Lords of the Council refused to comply. In December 1561, a hot dispute arose between the Council and the Kirk over the distribution of ecclesiastical revenues. The Protestant ministers were allotted a sixth, the Queen a sixth, the Catholic clergy, still in the great majority, 2/3. Knox summarized the matter by saying that 2 parts were given to the devil, and the third was divided between the devil and God. The ministers received, on an average, 100 marks, about $3,333, per year. Throughout the ensuing year, the clergy of the kirk continued to denounce the Queen. They were scandalized by the masques and revels, the singing, dancing, and flirting that went on at Mary's court. She diminished her amusements in deference to the protests, but the ministers felt that she had yet far to go, for she still heard Mass. John Knox, wrote a contemporary, thundereth out of the pulpit, so that I fear nothing so much as that one day he will mar all. He ruleth the roost, and of him all men stand in fear. Here again the Reformation came to grips with the Renaissance. On December 15, 1562, Mary summoned Knox. Before Murray, Lethington, and others, she accused him of teaching his followers to hate her. He answered, he says, that princes are more exercised in fiddling and flinging than in reading or hearing of God's most blessed word. And fiddlers and flatterers are more precious in their eyes than men of wisdom and gravity, who, by wholesome admonition, might beat down in them some part of that vanity and pride whereunto all are born, but in princes take deep root and strength by wicked education. According to Knox, the Queen replied with unwonted meekness, If ye hear anything of myself that mislikes you, come to myself and tell me, and I shall hear you. And he answered, I am called, madam, to a public function within the kirk of God, and was appointed by God to rebuke the sins and vices of all. I am not appointed to come to every man in particular to show him his offense, for that labor were infinite. If your grace please to frequent the public sermons, then doubt I not but that ye shall fully understand both what I like and mislike. She let him go in peace, but the war of faiths went on. At Easter of 1563, several Catholic priests who had violated the law by saying Mass were seized by local agents and were threatened with death for idolatry. Some were jailed, some escaped and hid in the woods. Mary sent for Knox once more and interceded for the imprisoned priests. He replied that if she would enforce the law, he would guarantee Protestant docility. Otherwise, he thought the papists deserved a lesson. I promise to do as you require, she said, and for a moment they were friends. At her order, the Archbishop of St. Andrews and 47 other priests were tried for saying Mass and were sentenced to prison. The ministers rejoiced, but a week later, May 26, 1563, when Mary and her ladies attended Parliament in their best raiment, and some of the people cried, God bless that sweet face, the ministers denounced the targeting, tasseling of their tails. And Knox wrote, Such stinking pride of women was never seen before in Scotland. Shortly thereafter he heard that Lethington was trying to arrange a marriage between Mary and Don Carlos, son of Philip II. Feeling that such a marriage would be fatal to Scottish Protestantism, Knox spoke his mind on the subject in a sermon preached to the nobles attending Parliament. And now, my lords, to put an end to all, I hear of the Queen's marriage. This, my lords, will I say, whensoever the nobility of Scotland, professing to Lord Jesus, consents that an infidel, and all papists are infidels, shall be head to your sovereign, ye do so far as in ye leeth to banish Christ Jesus from this realm. The Queen lost her temper. She summoned him and asked, he reports, What have ye to do with my marriage? Or what are ye in this commonwealth? He made a famous reply, A subject born within the same, madam, and albeit I neither be earl, lord, nor baron within it, yet as God made me, how abject that ever I be in your eyes, a profitable member within the same. Mary broke into tears and bade him leave her. His boldness reached its peak in October 1563. A crowd again gathered about the royal chapel to protest against the Mass that was about to be said there. Andrew Armstrong and Patrick Cranston entered the chapel and frightened the priest into retiring. The Queen, who had not been present, ordered the trial of the two Calvinists for invading her premises. On October 8th, Knox sent out a letter bidding all my brethren of all estates, classes, that have preferred the truth, to attend the trial. The Queen's Council judged this call to be treason, and cited Knox to stand trial before her. He came, December 21, 1563, but so great a crowd of his supporters gathered in the courtyard and on the stairs, and even to the chamber door where the Queen and her council sat, and he defended himself so skillfully that the council acquitted him, and the Queen said, "Mr. Knox, you may return to your home for this night." "I pray God," he replied, "to purge your heart from papistry." On Palm Sunday, 1564, the indomitable prophet, aged 59, married his second wife, Margaret Stuart, aged 17, a distant relative of the Queen. A year later, the Queen, too, married a second time. 4. The Queen in Love, 1565–68. Whom could she marry without a diplomatic mess? A Spaniard? But France and England would protest, and Protestant Scots would rage. A Frenchman? But England would oppose even to war any renewal of the Scottish-French alliance. An Austrian? The Archduke Charles? But Knox from the pulpit already thundered against union with a Catholic infidel, and Elizabeth let Mary know that marriage with a Habsburg, old foes of the Tudors, would be construed as a hostile act. In a moment of passion, Mary cut the diplomatic knot. Matthew Stuart, Earl of Lennox, who held himself to be the next in line to marry for the Scottish throne, had lost his estates by supporting Henry VIII against Scotland, and had fled to England to elude the Scots' revenge. Now, October 1564, he thought it timely to return. Soon thereafter came his 19-year-old son, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who through his mother was, like Mary, descended from Henry VII of England. Mary was charmed by the beardless youth. She admired his skill at tennis and on the lute. She forgave his vanity as the due of his good looks, and rushed into love before she could discern his lack of mind. On July 29, 1565, over the protests of Elizabeth and half her own council, Mary made the lad her husband and named him king. Murray retired from the council and joined the enemies of the headstrong Queen. She enjoyed a few months of troubled happiness. Her need for love had mounted in her 4 years of widowhood. It was pleasant to be desired. She gave her love unstintedly, and without stint she lavished gifts upon her mate. "All dignities that she can endue him with," reported Elizabeth's ambassador, Thomas Randolph, "are already given and granted. No man pleases her that contenteth not him. She hath given over unto him her whole will." Good fortune turned the boy's head. He became dictatorial and insolent, and he demanded joint powers of rule with the Queen. Meanwhile he caroused, drank heavily, alienated the council, had fits of jealousy, and suspected Mary of adultery with David Rizzio. Who was Rizzio? An Italian musician. He had come to Scotland in 1561, aged 28, in the train of the ambassador from Savoy. Mary, fond of music, attached him to her service as organizer of musical fetes. She enjoyed his wit, his quick intelligence, his varied continental culture. As he knew French and Latin well and wrote a fine Italian hand, she used him also as secretary. Soon she let him draft as well as write her foreign correspondence. He became an adviser, a power. He shared in directing policy. He ate with the Queen. Sometimes he sat closeted with her far into the night. The Scottish nobles, seeing themselves superseded and suspecting Rizzio of serving the Catholic cause, plotted to destroy him. At first Darnley himself had been captivated by the clever Italian. They had played together, slept together. But as Rizzio's functions and honors grew, and Darnley's foolishness reduced him to political impotence, the affection of the king for the servant become minister descended the gamut of feeling to hatred. When Mary became pregnant, Darnley thought she was bearing Rizzio's child. Randolph believed it, and a generation later Henri IV quipped that James I of England must be the modern Solomon, since his father was the harpist David. Having warmed his courage with whiskey, Darnley joined with the Earl of Morton, Baron Riven, and other nobles in a plot to murder Rizzio. They signed a band, pledging themselves to uphold Protestantism in Scotland and to give Darnley the crown matrimonial, full rights as Scotland's king, and the right of succession should Mary die. Darnley promised to protect the signers from the consequences of whatever crime, and to restore Murray and other banished lords. On March 6, 1566, Randolph revealed the plot to Cecil. On March 9th it was carried out. Darnley entered the boudoir where Mary, Rizzio, and Lady Argyle were at supper. He grasped and held the Queen. Morton, Riven, and others rushed in, dragged Rizzio from the room over Mary's helpless protests, and stabbed him to death on the stairs. 56 wounds for good measure and sure. Someone rang the town tocsin. A crowd of armed citizens marched on the palace, proposing to cut Mary to collops, but Darnley persuaded them to disperse. All that night and the next day, Mary remained in Holyrood Palace, a prisoner of the assassins. Meanwhile, she played upon Darnley's terror and love, and he helped and accompanied her when, on the following night, she escaped and fled to Dunbar. There, vowing revenge, she issued an appeal to all loyal supporters to come to her defense. Perhaps to divide her enemies, she recalled Murray to her council. The most effective of those who offered her protection was James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell. A strange and fateful character, not handsome but strong of body, passions, and will, an adventurer on land and sea, skilled with sword and rapier, cowing men with his cool audacity, alluring women with his talk, his recklessness, and his reputation for seducing them, but also a man of superior education, a lover of and author of books in an age when many a noble Scot could not write his name. At first the Queen had disliked him, for he had spoken ill of her, but that is one way of winning a woman's interest. Then, seeing his martial qualities, she had appointed him Lieutenant of the Border. Hearing of his familiarity with ships, she had made him Lord Admiral. Learning of his desire for Lady Jane Gordon's hand, she promoted their marriage. Now, fearing the assassins of Rizzio and suspecting her husband's complicity, she turned to Bothwell for protection and advice. She did not take to him precipitately, but his masculine qualities of courage, vigor, and confidence were those that her feminine nature had longed for and had not found in Francis II or Darnley. She noted how respect for his sword and his troops drove the conspirators into hiding or submission. Soon she felt secure enough to return to Holyrood. Though Knox had approved the murder of Rizzio, Mary quieted the ministers for a while by making better provision for their maintenance. The common Scots, never in love with the lords, sympathized with her, and for a few months more she enjoyed a general popularity. "I never saw the Queen so much beloved, esteemed, and honored," wrote the French ambassador, "or so great harmony among her subjects." Nevertheless, as she approached her confinement, she was obsessed with the thought that she would be murdered or deposed in her helplessness. When she safely gave birth to a boy, June 19, 1566, all Scotland rejoiced, as if foreseeing that this lad would be king of both Scotland and England. Mary was in apogee. But she was miserable with Darnley. He resented her renewed trust in Murray and her rising admiration for Bothwell. There was talk that Bothwell would kidnap the royal infant and rule in its name. Darnley accused the nobles of killing Rizzio and claimed innocence. In revenge, they sent to the Queen proof of his participation. Argyle, Lethington, and Bothwell proposed to the Queen that she should divorce him. She objected that this might endanger the succession. Lethington replied that they would find some means of freeing her from Darnley without prejudice to her son. She did not approve. She offered rather to retire from Scotland to let Darnley rule, and she ended the interview with a caution. "I will that ye do nothing whereby any spot may be laid to my honour or conscience, and therefore I pray you let the matter be as it is, abiding till God of his goodness put remedy thereto." Several times now she talked of suicide. In or about October 1566, Argyle, Sir James Balfour, Bothwell, and perhaps Lethington signed a pact to get rid of Darnley. The Earl of Lennox got wind of the plot and warned his son. Darnley, who had been living apart from Mary, joined his father in Glasgow, December 1566. There he fell ill, apparently from smallpox, though rumors of poison rose. Meanwhile, Mary's developing intimacy with Bothwell put her under suspicion of adultery. Knox openly called her a whore. She seems to have approached Archbishop Hamilton about arranging a divorce of Bothwell from his wife. She offered to visit Darnley. He sent her an insulting reply. She went to him nevertheless, January 22, 1567, asserted her fidelity, and reawakened his love. She begged him to return to Edinburgh, where she promised she would nurse him back to health and happiness. Here the casket letters enter upon the scene, and the rest of the story hinges in part on their authenticity, which is still in dispute after 400 years. They were allegedly found in a silver casket which was presented by Mary to Bothwell and was taken from a servant of Bothwell on June 20, 1567, by agents of the nobles who were then seeking to dethrone the Queen. The casket was opened on the following day by Morton Lethington and other members of the Privy Council. As exhibited soon thereafter to the Scottish Parliament, and later to the English Commission that tried Mary in 1568, the contents were 8 letters and some fragmentary poems, all in French, undated and unaddressed, but allegedly from Mary to Bothwell. The Lords of the Council swore to the Scottish Parliament that the letters were genuine and had not been tampered with. Mary claimed that they had been forged. Her son apparently considered them authentic, for he destroyed them. Only copies remain. Continental rulers, shown copies, acted as if believing them genuine. Elizabeth at first questioned, then hesitantly accepted their authenticity. Our first impulse on reading them is to doubt that a woman meditating the murder of her husband would so carelessly and extensively express her intentions in letters entrusted to carriers who might be intercepted or corrupted. It appears improbable that letters so incriminating to Bothwell should have been preserved by him, and it is equally improbable that anyone in Scotland, even the clever Lethington, who is especially suspected, could have forged any substantial part of these letters in the single day between the capture of the casket and the display of the letters to the Council or the Parliament. The most incriminating letter, the second, is strangely long, taking up 10 pages in print. If it was forged, it is a most remarkable forgery, for its emotional content seems as true to Mary's nature as its writing is like her hand. It shows Mary as a pitying, hesitating, and ashamed accomplice in the murder of Darnley. The ailing, fearful, trusting king allowed himself to be carried across Scotland in a litter and placed in the old parsonage of Kirkafield on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Mary explained that she could not at once take him to Holyrood lest he infect their child. For 2 weeks he lay there. Mary visited him daily and nursed him so sedulously that his strength returned, and he wrote to his father, February 7, 1567, "My good health is the sooner come through the good treatment of the Queen, which I assure you hath all this while, and yet doth use herself like a natural and loving wife. I hope yet that God will lighten our hearts with joy that have so long been afflicted with trouble." Why she should have nursed him back through tedious weeks if she knew that he was to be killed is part of the mystery of Mary Stuart. On the evening of February 9th she left him to attend the wedding of one of her maids at Holyrood. That night an explosion occurred in the Kirkafield house, and in the morning Darnley was found dead in the garden. Mary at first behaved like an innocent woman. She mourned and lamented and vowed vengeance. She had her room draped in black and curtained from the light, and she remained there in darkness and solitude. She ordered a judicial inquiry and proclaimed a reward in money and land for information leading to the capture of the criminals. When placards appeared on city walls charging Bothwell with the murder, some implicating the Queen, a proclamation called upon the accusers to come forth with their evidence and promised the informers protection and rewards. The author or authors of the placards refused to appear, but the Earl of Lennox urged the Queen to bring Bothwell to trial at once. Bothwell seconded their demand. On April 12th he stood trial. Lennox, either lacking proofs or fearing Bothwell's soldiers in the capital, remained in Glasgow. Bothwell was acquitted, and the Parliament officially declared him innocent. On April 19th he persuaded Argyle, Huntly, Morton, and a dozen other nobles to sign Ainsley's band, attesting their faith in his innocence, pledging themselves to defend him, and approving his marriage with Mary. She now favored Bothwell publicly and added to the many costly presents that she had already given him. On April 23rd, she visited her son at Stirling. She was fated never to see him again. On her way back to Edinburgh, she and Lethington were waylaid by Bothwell and his soldiers and were carried by force to Dunbar, April 24th. Lethington protested. Bothwell threatened to kill him. Mary saved him and he was released. Thereafter he joined the enemies of the Queen. At Dunbar, negotiations were resumed for Bothwell's divorce. On May 3rd, he and Mary returned to Edinburgh. She declared herself free from constraint. On May 7th, he was granted a divorce, and on the 15th, her Catholic confessor having refused to marry them, they were married according to the Protestant rite by the once Catholic Bishop of Orkney. Catholic Europe, formerly devoted to Mary, now turned against her as a lost soul. The Catholic clergy of Scotland stood aloof from her. The Protestant ministry called for her deposition. The populace was hostile. A sympathetic few attributed her reckless infatuation to a love potion given her by Bothwell. On June 10th, an armed band surrounded Borthwick Castle, where Mary and Bothwell were staying. They escaped, Mary dressed as a man. At Dunbar, Bothwell gathered 1,000 men, and with them he and Mary sought to force their way back to Edinburgh. They were opposed at Carbery Hill, June 15th, by an equal force bearing a banner painted with figures of Darnley dead and the child James VI. Bothwell offered to settle the issue by single combat. Mary refused to allow him. She agreed to surrender if Bothwell were permitted to escape. Later she claimed that the rebel leaders had promised loyalty to her if she joined them peacefully. Bothwell fled to the coast and made his way to Denmark. There, after 10 years of imprisonment by the Danish king, he died at the age of 42, 1578. Mary accompanied her captors to Edinburgh amid cries of soldiers and populace. "Burn the whore! Burn her! Kill her! Drown her!" She was placed under guard in the provost's house. Under her window, where she appeared disheveled and half-clad, the crowd continued to threaten her with the coarsest epithets. On June 17th, over her wild protests, she was removed to a remote and more secure imprisonment on an island in Loch Leven, a lake some 30 miles north of the capital. There, according to her secretary, Claude No, she gave birth prematurely to twins. She sent an appeal to the French government. It refused to interfere. Elizabeth instructed her envoy to promise Mary protection and to threaten the nobles with dire punishment if they should harm the Queen. Knox called for Mary's execution and predicted that God would scourge Scotland with a great plague if Mary should be spared. On June 20th, the Lords secured the casket letters. She appealed to the Parliament for a hearing. It refused on the ground that the letters sufficiently disposed of her case. On July 27th, she signed her abdication, and Murray was made regent for her son. For almost 11 months, she remained a captive in Loch Leven Castle. Gradually, the rigor of her confinement was relaxed. She ate with the family of William Douglas, Lord of the Castle. His younger brother George fell in love with her and helped her to escape, March 25, 1568. She was captured, but on May 2nd she tried again and succeeded. Protected by young Douglas, she reached the mainland, where she was met by a party of Catholics. They rode through the night to the Firth of Forth, crossed it, and found refuge in the home of the Hamiltons. In 5 days, 6,000 men gathered there, sworn to set her again on the throne. But Murray called the Protestants of Scotland to arms. At Langside, near Glasgow, the two forces met, May 13th. Mary's ill-disciplined army was overwhelmed. She took flight once more and rode wildly through 3 nights to Dundrennan Abbey on Solway Firth. Now she returned to its donor the diamond that Elizabeth had once given her dearest sister. And she added a message. "I send back to its queen this jewel, the token of her promised friendship and assistance." On May 16th, 1568, she crossed Solway Firth in an open fishing boat, entered England, and left her fate to her rival. 5. Expiation, 1568 to 87. From Carlisle she dispatched another message to Elizabeth, asking for an interview in which she might explain her behavior. Elizabeth, on principle averse to supporting rebellion against a legitimate sovereign, was inclined to invite her, but her counsel confused her with cautions. If Mary were allowed to proceed to France, the French government would be tempted to send an army to Scotland to restore her and make Scotland again a Catholic ally of France and a thorn in England's rear. Mary's claim to the throne of England would then be supported by French arms as well as by English Catholics. If Mary remained free in England, she would always be a possible source and center of Catholic revolt, and England was at heart still predominantly Catholic. If England should force the Scottish nobles to re-enthrone their queen, their lives would be endangered and England would lose her Protestant allies in Scotland. Cecil would probably have agreed with Hallam that the forcible detention of the Queen of Scots violated all law, natural, public, and municipal, but he felt that his overriding responsibility was to protect England. As one function of diplomacy is to dress realism in morality, Mary was told that before her request for an interview with Elizabeth could be granted, she must clear herself of various charges before a trial commission. Mary replied that she was a queen and could not be judged by lay commissioners, especially of another nation, and she demanded freedom to return to Scotland or go to France. She asked to meet Morton and Lethington in Elizabeth's presence, and promised to prove them guilty of Darnley's death. The English council ordered her removed from Carlisle, as too near the border, to Bolton Castle near York, July 13th, 1568. Mary submitted to loose imprisonment there on Elizabeth's promise, "Put yourself in my hands without reserve. I will listen to nothing which shall be said against you. Your honor shall be safe, and you shall be restored to your throne." So mollified, Mary consented to appoint representatives to an examining commission. She tried to please Elizabeth by pretending to accept the Anglican faith and creed, but she assured Philip of Spain that she would never abandon the Catholic cause. From that time onward, Mary and Elizabeth ran an equal race in duplicity, the one excusing herself as a betrayed and royal prisoner, the other as an endangered queen. The trial commission met at York October 4th, 1568. Mary was represented by 7 men, chiefly John Leslie, Catholic Bishop of Ross, and the Catholic Lord Harris of the Western Marches of Scotland. Elizabeth had appointed 3 Protestants, the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl of Sussex, and Sir Ralph Sadler. Before them appeared Murray, Morton, and Lethington, who privately showed the Englishmen the casket letters. If, they said, Mary would recognize Murray as regent and agree to reside in England on a large pension from Scotland, the letters would not be made public. Norfolk, who dreamed of marrying Mary and thereby becoming King of England on Elizabeth's death, refused, and Sussex wrote to Elizabeth that Mary seemed likely to prove her case. Elizabeth ordered the trial transferred to Westminster. There Murray laid the casket letters before her council. Opinion remained divided as to the authenticity of the documents, but Elizabeth ruled that she could not receive Mary until the authenticity had been disproved. Mary asked to be shown the letters, either originals or copies. The commissioners refused, and Mary never saw either copies or originals. The commission disbanded without announcing a decision, January 11th, 1569. Murray was received by Elizabeth and then returned to Scotland with the letters. Mary, angry and defiant, was removed to stricter custody at Tutbury on the Trent. Foreign governments protested. Elizabeth replied that if they saw the evidence that had been presented to the commission, they would consider her treatment of Mary rather lenient than severe. The Spanish ambassador advised Philip to invade England and promised the collaboration of Catholic North England. Philip was skeptical of such aid, and Alva warned him that Elizabeth might order Mary's death at the first sign of invasion or revolt. Revolt came. On November 14th, 1569, the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland led a rebel army of 5,700 men into Durham, overthrew the Anglican Communion Board, burned the Book of Common Prayer, restored the Catholic altar, and heard Mass. They planned a dash into Tutbury to release Mary, but Elizabeth balked them by transferring Mary to Coventry, November 23, 1569. The Earl of Sussex, with an army largely composed of Catholics, rapidly suppressed the rebellion. Elizabeth ordered all captured insurgents and their conniving servants to be hanged, and the bodies were not to be removed, but remained till they fell to pieces where they hung. Some 600 men were so disposed of, and their property was confiscated by the Crown. Northumberland and Westmoreland escaped to Scotland. In February 1570, Leonard Dacres led another uprising of Catholics. He too was defeated and fled across the border. In January 1570, Knox wrote to Cecil advising him to order Mary's death at once. For if he strike not at the root, the branches that appear to be broken will bud again. He had now finished his History of the Reformation of Religion within the realm of Scotland, a book making no pretense to impartiality, a narrative inaccurate but vivid and vital, a style quaint and idiomatic, sharp with the tongue of a preacher who called a whore. A bitter man but a great man, building his dream to power more complete than Calvin's, hating heartily, fighting bravely, consuming to the last flicker the incredible energy of a tenacious will. By 1572 he had worn himself out. He could no longer walk unsupported, but he had himself aided every Sunday to his pulpit at St. Giles's. On November 9, 1572, he preached for the last time, and the entire congregation escorted him to his home. He died on November 24th, aged 67, almost as poor as he had been born. He had not made merchandise of the Word of God. He left posterity to judge him. What I have been to my country, albeit this unthankful age will not know, yet the ages to come will be compelled to bear witness to the truth. Few men have had so decisive an influence upon the beliefs of a people. Few of his time equaled him in encouragement given to education, fanaticism, and self-government. He and Mary divided the soul of Scotland between them. He was the Reformation, she was the Renaissance. She lost because she did not know, like Elizabeth, how to marry them. Mary, like some restless tiger caged, tried every corner and possibility of escape. In March 1571, Roberto di Ridolfi, a Florentine banker active in London, made himself an intermediary between Mary, the Spanish ambassador, the Bishop of Ross, Alva, Philip, and Pope Pius V. He proposed that Alva should send Spanish troops into England from the Netherlands, that a Catholic force should simultaneously invade England from Scotland, that Elizabeth should be dethroned, that Mary should be made Queen of England and Scotland, and that Norfolk should marry her. Norfolk was told of the plan, did not clearly approve of it, did not reveal it. Mary tentatively consented. The Pope gave Ridolfi money for the enterprise and promised to recommend it to Philip. Philip made his own approval conditional on Alva's. Alva ridiculed the project as visionary, and nothing came of it but tragedy for Mary's friends. Letters of Ridolfi and Norfolk were found on arrested servants of Mary and the Duke. Norfolk, Ross, and several Catholic nobles were imprisoned. Norfolk was tried for treason and convicted. Elizabeth hesitated to sign the death warrant of so prominent a noble, but Cecil, the English Parliament, and the Anglican hierarchy called for the execution of both Norfolk and Mary. Elizabeth compromised by sending Norfolk to the block, June 2, 1572. When news reached England of the massacre of St. Bartholomew, August 22nd, there were revived cries for the death of Mary, but Elizabeth still refused. Only by remembering that Mary's captivity lasted almost 19 years can we understand her desperation and her sense of bitter wrong. Her place of imprisonment was repeatedly changed, lest the sympathy felt for her in the neighborhood and among her custodians should beget or abet new plots. The conditions of her confinement were humane. She was permitted to receive her French pension of £1,200 a year. The English government gave her a substantial sum for food, medical treatment, servants, and entertainment. She was allowed to attend Mass and other Catholic services. She tried to pass the long hours with embroidery, reading, gardening, and play with her pet spaniels. As her hope of freedom faded, she lost interest in caring for herself. She took less exercise and became flaccid and fat. She suffered from rheumatism. Sometimes her legs were so swollen that she could not walk. By 1577, when she was only 35, her hair had turned white, and thereafter she covered it with a wig. In June 1583 she offered, if released, to withdraw all claim to the English crown, never more to communicate with conspirators, to live anywhere in England according to Elizabeth's choice, never to go more than 10 miles from that residence, and to submit to surveillance by neighboring gentlemen. Elizabeth was advised not to trust her. Mary resumed her schemes for escape. By a variety of desperate devices, she managed to correspond secretly with the French and Spanish ambassadors and governments, with her adherents in Scotland, and with representatives of the Pope. Letters were smuggled in and out, in the washing, in books, in sticks, in wigs, in the lining of shoes. But the spies of Cecil and Walsingham uncovered every plot in time. Even among the students and priests at the Jesuit college in Reims, Walsingham had an agent who kept him informed. The romantic aura of the captive queen touched the sympathy of many young Englishmen and aroused the ardor of Catholic youths. In 1583, Francis Throckmorton, Catholic nephew of Elizabeth's late ambassador to France, organized another plot to release her. He was soon detected. Tortured into confession, he moaned, "I have disclosed the secrets of her who was the dearest to me in all the world." He died under the executioner's axe at the age of 30. A year later, William Parry, a spy in Cecil's service, induced a papal nuncio in Paris to forward to Gregory XIII a request for a plenary indulgence on the ground that he was entering upon a dangerous attempt to free Mary Stuart and bring England back to the Catholic Church. The papal Secretary of State replied, January 30th, 1584, that the Pope had seen Parry's petition, rejoiced at his resolve, was sending him the desired indulgence, and would reward his efforts. Parry took this reply to Cecil. Another English spy, Edmund Neville, accused Parry of urging him to assassinate Elizabeth. Parry was arrested, confessed, was hanged, and still alive was cut down and dismembered. Angered by a long succession of conspiracies, and frightened by the assassination of William of Orange, Elizabeth's council drew up, October 1584, a bond of association, pledging the signers never to accept as successor to their queen any person in whose behalf Elizabeth's life had been attempted, and to prosecute to the death any person involved in such an enterprise. The bond was signed by the council, by most members of Parliament, and by prominent men throughout England. A year later, Parliament gave it the sanction of law. It did not deter further plots. In 1586, John Ballard, a Roman Catholic priest, induced Anthony Babington, a rich young Catholic, to organize a conspiracy for the assassination of Elizabeth, the invasion of England by armies from Spain, France, and the Low Countries, and the enthronement of Mary. Babington wrote to Mary about the plot, told her that 6 Catholic nobles had agreed to get rid of the usurper of the throne, and asked her approval of the plan. In a letter of July 17, 1586, Mary accepted Babington's proposals, gave no explicit consent to the assassination of Elizabeth, but promised rewards for the success of the undertaking. The messenger to whom her secretary entrusted this reply was a secret agent of Walsingham. He had the letter copied and sent the copy to Walsingham and the letter itself to Babington. On August 14th, Babington and Ballard were arrested. Soon 300 prominent Catholics were jailed. The 2 leaders confessed, and Mary's secretary was induced to acknowledge the authenticity of Mary's letter. 13 of the conspirators were executed. Bonfires were lighted throughout London, bells rang, and children sang psalms in thanksgiving for the preservation of Elizabeth's life. All Protestant England cried out for Mary's death. Mary's rooms were searched and all her papers were seized. On October 6th, she was transferred to Fotheringay Castle. There she was tried by a commission of 43 nobles. She was not allowed a defender, but she defended herself resolutely. She admitted complicity in the Babington plot, but denied having sanctioned assassination. She protested that as a person unjustly and illegally imprisoned for 19 years, she had a right to free herself by whatever means. She was unanimously condemned, and Parliament asked Elizabeth to order her death. Henry III of France made a polite plea for mercy, but Elizabeth thought that such a plea came with poor grace from a government that had massacred thousands of Protestants without trial. Most of Scotland now defended its queen, but her son made only a half-hearted intercession, for he suspected that because of his Protestantism she had disowned him in her will. His agent in London suggested to Walsingham that James VI, though anxious that his mother should not be beheaded, might be reconciled to much if the English Parliament would confirm his title to succeed Elizabeth, and if Elizabeth would increase the pension she had been sending him. The very canny Scot dallied so greedily that the citizens of Edinburgh hooted him in the streets. Nothing remained between Mary and death but Elizabeth's hesitation. The harassed queen allowed almost 3 months to drag by before she made up her mind, and then she did not. She was capable of generosity and mercy, but she was tired of living every day in fear of assassination by the adherents of a woman who had claimed her throne. She considered the danger of invasion from France, Spain, and Scotland in protest against the execution of a queen, and she calculated the possibility that she herself might suffer a natural or violent death in time to let Mary and Catholicism inherit England. Cecil urged her to sign the death warrant and promised to take full responsibility for the results. She thought to avoid decision by intimating that Sir Amias Paulet, Mary's keeper, could clear up the confusion by ordering Mary's execution on a merely verbal understanding that the Queen or her council desired it. But Paulet refused to act without a written order from Elizabeth. Finally she signed the warrant. Her secretary, William Davison, delivered it to the council, which at once dispatched it to Paulet before Elizabeth could change her mind. Mary, who during this long delay had begun to hope, met the news at first with unbelief, then with courage. She wrote a touching letter to Elizabeth asking her to permit my poor desolated servants to carry away my corpse, to bury it in holy ground with the other queens of France. On the morning of her execution, we are told, she wrote a little Latin poem having all the grace and fervor of a medieval hymn. O Domine Deus, speravi in te, O cari mi Iesu, nunc libera me, in dura catena, in misera poena, desidero te, languendo, gemendo, et genuflectendo, adoro, imploro, ut liberes me. She asked to be allowed to confess to her Catholic chaplain. She was refused. Her jailers offered her an Anglican dean instead. She rejected him. She robed herself royally to meet death, arranged her false hair carefully, and covered her face with a white veil. A golden crucifix hung from her neck, an ivory crucifix was in her hand. She inquired why her attendant women were forbidden to be present at her execution. She was told that they might make a disturbance. She promised that they would not, and she was allowed to take 2 of them and 4 men. Some 300 English gentlemen were admitted to the scene in the Great Hall of Fotheringay Castle, February 8, 1587. 2 masked executioners asked and received her forgiveness. When her women began to cry, she checked them, saying, "I promised for you." She knelt and prayed, then laid her head upon the block. The wig fell from her severed head and disclosed her white hair. She was 44 years old. Pardon is the word for all. Pardon for Mary, who labored bravely to be a just as well as a joyful queen. We cannot believe that she who tended her husband so long and brought him back to health had consented to his murder. We can forgive the young woman who gave up everything for a love, however foolish. We must pity the desolate woman who came to England for refuge and found instead 19 years of imprisonment, and we can understand her wild attempts to regain her liberty. But we can also forgive the great queen, whose counselors insisted on Mary's confinement as vital to England's security, who saw her life and policy continually threatened by plots to free and enthrone her rival, and who prolonged that cruel captivity only because she could not bring herself to end it with a warrant for Mary's execution. They were both noble women, one noble and hastily emotional, the other noble and hesitantly wise. Fitly, they lie near each other in Westminster Abbey, reconciled in death and peace.